thank you all for allowing me to move around. I'm Italian. I am unable to talk without moving. But let me talk to you about music for the development of auditory skills, the implications for education, in particular, the implications for reading. So, as Paula said, music training changes sound processing in the brain, not only for music, but for a number of other non-musical skills. And we're interested in how music education influences everyday listening and learning skills. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about hearing and noise. Today I'm going to talk about reading. And the idea is that music is a model for plasticity in the auditory system. And this whole idea of auditory system plasticity, of course, is, this is the backbone of a good deal of neuroscience. The idea that our sensory systems throughout the system are modulated by experience is something that we have a lot of information on a cellular and a systems and a cognitive level. And so, really our music work and the work on the biology of music is really just a way of using music as a model for looking at neuroplasticity. And of course, we really much want to know what is the effect of musical experience on the nervous system. So a few words I will say about music being this powerful vehicle of change for neuronal function. I'll really race through just a couple of points about what we know about how music changes the nervous system in general for sensory and cognitive skills. But I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about reading and the timing story. So that's where I'm going to slow down. And I really hope that you will be able to follow me every step of the way. And I'll end with some theoretical considerations. So music then is biologically powerful. And it has lasting effects on our nervous system within our lifetime. So you can consider evolution across millennia, but yet in our little bodies we have an experiment, an evolutionary experiment that we are able to tap into and see how is it that our body and our nervous system changes throughout lives. And Ani Patel calls music a transformative technology of the mind. And so we know that music really does transform sound processing in the brain. And a few words about some of the metrics that we use. Typically, when you are recording, trying to measure some biological response from the nervous system, the response that you get is a very abstract representation of a physical sound stimulus. And what we are able to do is, in fact, to record responses from the nervous system that physically resemble the acoustic characteristics of the sounds that have been used to evoke the biological response. So what we do is just with a couple of scalp electrodes, so these are responses that can be measured across the lifespan very easily. And you can see, for example, here is the speech sound da. Here is the brain's response to da. And just by looking at the physical characteristics of the stimulus and the response, you see that they physically resemble each other. You can actually take the response of the nervous system and play it back, and it will sound like the evoking stimulus. So here is the speech sound da, the stimulus. Here is the brain's response. Pitch contour, I'm asking a question. All right, so that second part is, I'll play that again because it's just so cool. Okay, that second part was the nervous system of some of you sitting in the front row. I invite you to visit our website. You can see this demonstration right on the home page again. And anyway, so speech and music involve acoustic elements of pitch, timing, and timbre. And we are able, again, to see elements of timing, pitch, and timbre in the stimulus in black and in the response. And this is timing on the order of fractions of milliseconds, so it's really precision timing. Another very important point is that, of course, our sensory systems take sound and deliver the information to our brain. What is equally important, if not more important, are the many corticofugal, efferent, top-down pathways that connect our cerebral cortex through our brainstem all the way out to our hair cells in our inner ear. And also we have information from every part of the brain that interconnects. And the brain works as a unit. The brain is not like we scientists who have little organizations that look at this and that part of the nervous system. The brain doesn't work that way. So pitch timing and timbre and harmonics are emphasized with musical training. And you can imagine how you just need to be able to hear the pitch to just to tune a violin, right? Okay, in terms of the methodology, if anybody is interested, we have a number of publications. This is one of them that will explain the nitty-gritty of this particular methodology. So, a few words then about just some great big sweeping findings about music for smarter hearing. This is work that Gabriela Musacchia, who's sitting right over there, did in our lab a number of years ago, where she made a fundamental discovery that when we have musical experience, by the way, when I talk about people with musical experience, I talk about musicians. You don't have to be a professional musician. These are people who have regularly engaged in music throughout their lives. So it could be a hack musician like me, who, if on a good week, I will get 5 hours of playing music. That's not a good week. But anyway, what Gabriela found was that musical experience changes the nervous system not only for the processing of music, but also for speech. So here is the speech sound da, and you can see that the response of the musician's brain, that is shown in red, is clearly enhanced and more vigorous. And this is to speech sounds. We know Laurel Trainer has a very nice summary of so many of the cognitive benefits, especially for auditory attention and auditory memory, that some students will be talking about tomorrow from our group. And in particular, this idea of auditory and visual attention. These are cognitive skills, especially in the auditory domain, that seem to be enhanced in people who have musical experience. Okay, so now we finally get to reading. This idea that music and reading might go together, the idea that some of the skills that are trained when one is trained in music might also be some of the skills that are deficient in a child who has a reading problem, and also are just important skills for sound-based tasks like reading in a normally developing child. This idea is not new, and in fact, Paula Talal and Nadine Gabb, sitting right here, are among some of the people who have made these connections in the past. So I get to stand on great big shoulders. There has been some work, but not very much, that has really looked at the effect of musical experience. This was a study where kids were randomly assigned to art or to music classes, and they were tested before and after 6 months of training. This is studied by Moreno and al. This was done actually in France. He's now in Canada. But the kids who had music lessons were able, you could see from their neural responses to pitch changes that were apparent whether the pitch changes occurred in speech or in music. The kids who had the musical lessons, their nervous system just could automatically detect these rather subtle changes in pitch. And importantly, these subtle changes in pitch were not found in the kids who had art lessons. And germane to our discussion here is that there were reading enhancements that were found in the musically trained kids. These were just this was a tiny study. So much work is being done. Reading, we know, involves a combination of sensory and cognitive functions. Again, there is a lot of literature out there that is pointing to the fact that we need our sound-based skills and we need our cognitive functions. These things are all involved in reading. An important component, and the one that I'm going to settle on now, is timing and how timing relates to reading. So this idea of neural encoding of time and its relationship with reading. So here you can have a time scale going from slow to fast time. And this initial fundamental idea that language-impaired children have difficulty with a host of rapid timing tasks is one that Paula championed now decades ago. And this is just fundamental work. And from that, we now know that infants and their abilities to perceive timing and signals can predict their future language ability, April Benesich's work. Importantly, this idea of experience-dependent plasticity, that training, auditory training, we're not talking about music right now, but auditory training can help develop auditory processing in the brain and develop auditory processing in a way that benefits reading ability. There are neural correlates, so Nadine Gabb's work has told us a lot about what is happening biologically. This is where we really need to understand more. Resting EEG. This isn't even EEG that is evoked by sound, but that the biological rhythms of the brain are very, very important to a child's skills that are going to eventually lead to successful reading. And the idea that it's not just fast timing, but the timing of the slower rates of speech that are kind of at a fundamental beat and pulse that often is essential to music, that also can be impaired in poor readers. And the idea here is that musicians seem to have temporal processing abilities that exceed those of the normal listener. Okay, so that's kind of the main concept here. So let me now show you some data. So we have done some work showing that on top here you see the speech sound da, and you see some waves. The red waves are the reading impaired kids, and the black ones are typically developing readers. And as you can see from some of these peaks here that are expanded, the timing in the reading impaired kids is later. It's later, and this is tiny timing. This is timing on the order of fractions of milliseconds, big p-values. So these timing differences, our nervous system is so exquisitely tuned to time. And these subtle timing differences really matter. And so we and other labs have now, I think, shown this nicely. The idea that differentiating speech sounds, okay, so here we have stop consonants that have been studied a lot with reading. And their differentiation in reading, and also they're very vulnerable to background noise. How is it that the nervous system encodes these sounds and importantly differentiates among them? What we find is that differences in frequency can be distinguished by the nervous system by neural timing. So just based on the tonotopicity of the nervous system, we know that higher frequency sounds are going to evoke faster neural activity, and the ability of the nervous system to demonstrate these timing differences distinctly, what we have found is, so in other words, the nervous system's ability to differentiate stop consonants based on timing relates to reading ability. Okay, so this matters. How the nervous system handles the timing involved in processing and distinguishing these consonants relates to reading ability. We now have a slicker way of looking at this because the other side of time is phase. Phase and time are the two sides of the same coin. And so you can take two signals. Here are two very simple signals, a 50 hertz signal, and one is leading the other by a little bit. And what we can do is we know that for 50 hertz, the cross-phase spectrogram tells us that they differ in phase by about 0.63 radians, or 2 milliseconds. So this idea that radians can be translated to time. If you have a simple stimulus, so now you can see a simple stimulus is not that interesting. You have basically this phase lead. But if you look at a stop consonant, now this is the difference between ba and da. And this takes actually a few minutes to compute. So this is automated. You can download this paper and get the information. We are happy to send anybody who would like it, the software. But so if you look at a formant transition period here, this is where the consonants ba, da, and ga differ. This is the pre-stimulus period. This is the vowel that they share. There is no difference here, but there is a difference here. And importantly, if you look now at good and poor readers, the same differences that we saw in the timing where we had to laboriously pick the peaks, you can just do this now automatically and see that the good readers are able to distinguish between stop consonants based on their timing much more precisely, and low musicians are able to disambiguate these stop consonants better than non-musicians. Okay? Timing and noise, timing delays and noise, anytime you present a sound and now it's noisy, that's going to cause a delay in the neural timing in any system, any normal system. And what we have been able to find is that the extent of the delay, this is timing delay across the formant, the vulnerable formant transition period of a stop consonant da, the extent of the delay that is imposed by noise is greater in poor readers than in good readers. So again, you see timing, and that it is affected, and it is negatively affected in poor readers to a greater extent than in good readers. And here's the other side. In musicians, this is work that Alexandra Parby-Clark over here has been leading. What she finds is that in noise, musicians' timing delays are less. So this is a strength that musical training is imparting, a strength that seems to be needed by kids to read. The representation of the harmonics, I'm just going to briefly make this point, is something that is impaired in poor readers. Here the poor readers are again in red. And again, the representation of the harmonics in sounds is something that is enhanced in musicians. Okay? Let me speak for a minute about these well-established patterns of laterality, cortical laterality, timing. Okay, so the work of Popel and Satori have really given us very nice, and others have given us very nice frameworks for thinking about what the right and the left hemisphere do in terms of time, where there's this bias in the left hemisphere for fast occurring sounds, and that the right hemisphere is more biased for slowly occurring sounds. And reading, we know in terms of hemispheric lateralization, it is not new news that poor readers often do not demonstrate the normal patterns of laterality. They have more symmetrical processing between the hemispheres. When we recorded cortical potentials, what we have found is that there is an asymmetry. This is the left versus right. We see that children with better reading skills, not surprisingly, have more left lateralized patterns of cortical responses to rapidly occurring speech sounds. And interestingly, some of the fast timing that we see in the brainstem, so actually the data that I was showing you before is subcortical data for the most part, but I don't like to even say where it's coming from because it is so influenced by every other part of the nervous system. It could be coming from our toe. It just doesn't matter. It is reflecting integration across multiple systems, but the timing that we see at these lower levels is very much reflected in patterns of cortical lateralization, so that the kids who have the faster neural timing in the signals that I showed you earlier are also the kids who have the most lateralized brain response cortically. Okay? This idea that the slower syllable rate of speech is something that can be impaired in poor readers is some work that Usha Goswami has been pioneering. And she had kids listen to words that had different stresses, like Harry Potter, mama, mama. And then she asked the children to repeat those same syllables. So these are syllable rates of speech, syllable rates of timing. And what she found is that a typically developing child is able to very easily mimic, copy. If you say ma, ma, they will say ma, ma. But a dyslexic child is going to equally stress. They'll make both syllables louder, but they will stress them both equally. So it's not as though they're disambiguating the differences in these syllable rates of speech. She also looked at the perception of the syllable rate of speech. So listen to this. That's one sound. So was the first series different or the same as the second series? It was different. So, you know, the fermata over here, oops, sorry, is present in that second series, and it sounds different. But dyslexic kids have difficulty distinguishing these very basic rhythms. And so, you know, the idea that she is imparting is that neural sampling, especially on the order of theta rhythms, she's arguing are important for reading. And what is kind of important about the sort of 5 hertz range of timing, which translates to about 100, 200 milliseconds, is that this is the syllable rate of speech, and it's also it's a principal unit that is often found in music. And we then took this idea, and we wanted to look at hemispheric lateralization again for the syllable rate of speech. So here we took a sentence. This is Dan Abrams' work. He's currently doing a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford. He looked at the young boy left home, and these rectified amplitude plots are the stimulus, just showing a stimulus that changes at the syllable rate of speech, because these are syllables. And what he found is that there is a bias, as you might predict from Zatori and Popel's work, to the right hemisphere for the syllable rate of speech. And he found that this varied very nicely with reading ability, so that the better readers had the most right lateralized syllable rate of speech processing, and this was impaired in dyslexia. So there you go. This is what I asked John before the, because I've been scouring his work, you know, like what do we know about syllable rate encoding in musicians? This, I understand now, is work to be done, because John has shown that the syllable rate of processing is in fact experience dependent, because in work that he has shown that your language experience matters and will influence your ability to process beats. We don't really know yet about is there a musician advantage? So here is Iverson's work, published in JAZA. One final point about temporal processing in terms of data. Is it just behaviorally? You can take a stimulus and present it without masking, so just any old sound, or you can present it with simultaneous masking, so you have some, maybe a white noise presented at the same time as you're presenting a tone. And we know that the ability of people to detect these differences depends in part on their the health of their inner ear. You can also have kids do a slightly tougher task, or the kinds of tasks that you have kids do where the syllables are changing in time. Here, backward masking, a masker that occurs later in time is actually affecting the perception of a tone that occurs earlier, speaking to the idea that we have these temporal integration windows, right? And what is important here is that these skills are dependent not only on our ears, but on our cognitive abilities. So in other words, what you do with what you hear, okay? And again, there is a whole line of work here. Some people have looked specifically at backward masking, and other investigators have just looked at the processing of stimuli that change rapidly in time and have found that this is impaired in dyslexia. Many of these people are right in this room. And what our work has been showing is that musicians have enhanced backward masking abilities. Okay? And there were no group differences in this static and the simultaneous masking. Okay? So to summarize this, a properly functioning nervous system processes timing cues in speech over a broad time range. Converging evidence is existing that is telling us that reading difficulties may arise from improper processing of speech timing across these ranges. We've begun to uncover some biological bases of this, and I think there's a lot of hope for very early assessment, tracking, and training. And the bottom line here is that it would appear that music strengthens brain mechanisms that underlie reading. Okay, so here I just want to end with some theoretical considerations. So I started out at the beginning saying that our auditory system is experience dependent. So, what is it about musical experience that changes our sound processing in the brain? Well, musicians are always making sound to meaning relationships. And here are a couple of examples. So, we know about harmonic relations, major, minor thirds, diminished, augmented chords. We know about dynamics that will signal mood. They will signal the timing of notes, just the fact that there is a relationship between notes and a score, diminuendo, with all of these signals of dynamics. Tonality is a sound to meaning association. There are historic sounds like the Tristan chord that we make these associations with. We learn these. And to make an analogy here, these sound to meaning connections are made so here is dad who's listening to his baby crying, and he learns his baby specific cry. I mean, how many of you have seen the March of the Penguins? Right? I mean, it was amazing to see how these mommy penguins could recognize the cries of their babies amidst all these other baby penguins squealing. I mean, this is a real sound to meaning association. And so presumably neural connections are formed, and this is the kind of information that we as biologists are trying to uncover and understand. And so then eventually dad can confidently pick out his baby's cry among others' babies crying. And of course, he can do what he wishes with the information. So I do want to mention this idea, just to kind of end with this idea of top-down processing, efferent tuning, if you will. We know by these whole studies that sound processing in the brain is modulated all the way down to our hair cells. So we can measure responses from our outer hair cells that we know are modulated from activity of the efferent system. And importantly, this hair cell activity, we know not only is it modulated from upstairs, but it is modulated more efficiently in musicians. And here is a whole series of studies showing that right at our hair cell level, in our cochlea, that musical experience is affecting the processing of sound. And that's wild. So in an article where, this is a review article, we reviewed data from all over the world using different philosophies, different approaches that really, I think, are coming to a converging view that we're interpreting in this corticofugal, efferent, top-down framework. The idea that the sound to meaning connections that one makes when one is playing music is affecting the auditory system in very fundamental ways, ways in which the nervous system is automatically, while we're sleeping, because of what we're doing when we're not sleeping, while we're sleeping, our nervous system can detect patterns better, the kinds of patterns, the statistical patterns that we know poor readers are terrible at. We have a system that is dynamic, it changes, but it's also stable, and that there is a selective enhancement for meaningful sounds. This is not a volume knob effect where everything is just bigger. So these are some of our ongoing projects. We have a cross-sectional study where we are looking at children across these life ages and looking at biological and learning outcomes. In the works, we have a big project here looking at high school kids who have music education now delivered in the school. These are kids, charter schools in Chicago, serving exclusively low SES families. And we know most of the work that we have today, the data on musical experience in the nervous system, is on people who are privileged enough to be able to afford private instruction. These kids, I mean, one of the things we know about them, coming into the study, they're pretty equal in terms of musical lessons. They haven't had them. And they come into these programs, and some of the schools are offering music. And so we are going to be tracking these kids over the next 4 years and looking at the effects of musical experience. The control group are kids who are in ROTC, so they are getting also physical activity, but it's not music. But they are equally active because it's not fair to compare people who are doing something with people who are doing nothing. Again, looking at biological and learning outcomes. We have another study where we're looking at poor readers in this is the other end of the spectrum, very privileged school for very smart kids who just they're just dyslexic. And they come into this school, they're given very intensive reading therapy, and then they're spit out and mainstreamed again. And some of the classroom kids are wearing an EduLink, which is an auditory training assistive listening device, which makes some of those difficult to hear sounds perceptually perhaps a little bit more easy to hear. And again, we're following these kids over years to look at reading and biological and cognitive outcomes. Finally, we're looking at the other age of the spectrum. And this is, again, using work that is, I understand, built on Fast Forward. This is the POSIT training program that we're looking at older adults and seeing how computer-based auditory training may help their ability to hear speech and background noise, which is a really terrible, terrible difficulty that we experience as we get older, and it leads to social isolation and depression. And so what can we do to improve people's ability to hear a noise, which again is a cognitive and sensory bound activity. So in the end, one of the things that I really do want to mention here is that in terms of the metrics that we are developing, if any of you, I mean, we're working with some companies now to make the technology that we're using accessible to anybody who wants to use it. You people here have the wherewithal to do it because you know how to record biological signals. But there's so many people, people who do genetic engineering, for example, who are interested in auditory processing in animals. And there are many people who are studying kids on the autism spectrum who are looking for early assessment and would like to follow kids through programs. And so we're really looking to be able to partner with companies that can help to make this technology, which is very, very simple in many ways. It's fundamentally already out there and existing, just accessible to people so that it can be used in various ways. So music then provides a very strong foundation for other auditory functions, and it facilitates these sound to meaning associations. It is a biological it just works on the fact that biologically we have adaptive sensory systems. And I hope that I've convinced you, but you already knew, I think, walking in the door, that music is biologically powerful and changes our nervous system throughout our lives. And the educational, the reading implications they're huge. They're absolutely enormous. And because musical experience really would seem to enhance auditory-based skills that are fundamental to reading. These are our lists of the various wonderful, I have the most wonderful laboratory of people who make the work that I'm talking about today happen. And our work, mercifully, is funded, most of our music work is funded by the National Institutes of Health. And the National Science Foundation is funding the music work. We have wonderful collaborators, and I would like to present to you some of the students who are currently in the lab and who will be presenting. They're here today, and they will be presenting tomorrow at the National Academy of Sciences. And they are all musicians as well as scientists: Alexandra Parbury-Clark, Emily Hittner, Samantha O'Connell, Jessica Slater, and Dana Straight, who is in South Africa studying at the moment. I invite you to please visit our website. I have cards, by the way. I brought cards for you if anybody wants them. Again, logo designed by another graduate student who is currently in Leipzig. But really, we do think that it's important, and I think this is something that Paula has championed for so many years, and that April, you're so good at talking about the idea that we need to bring our little discoveries out into the educational and the medical environments, to bring this information to parents, to teachers, to educators. We try to do this with our little website, so please visit it. Give us any feedback to make it better, because we're just doing it. We're not experts. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention.